Hi, my name's Philip Bither. I'm Curator for Performing Arts here at the Walker Arts Center. Really pleased to have Kaneza Schaal, writer, performer, theater artist, director, here with us. Last night we premiered King Leopold II, KL2, and Kaneza, I'm interested in how you're feeling. We were just talking a little bit about that process of creation over several years now, and then the chance to unveil it in a premiere to a public, and that mix of things you're thinking about and things that you're feeling now, having gotten through opening night and offered it to a public.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's such a tender moment. I love the listening that happens after you first invite an audience to meet a work with you. And with KL2, the audience is so deeply implied in the performance. Structurally, it's 6 acts and based on a kind of Catholic exorcism structure. And the first act is the audience washing their hands. And so we can only build this piece with the people who come to join with us. So I feel like this is the first time we've even been able to rehearse the work or actually, work our way through the performance. So it's thrilling to kind of hear and listen and understand each of the sections of the piece.
Do you think that will lead to shifts or just minor adjustments, or not, or did it go perfectly? Yeah.
I think always, I feel like one of the great things about being in spaces that listen to artists is you get to build processes of working that allow you to keep developing the piece. So, we have our tech time this morning.
Yes, right.
And we'll think about what we heard from people, what we understood from having bodies in the room with us, and get to keep dipping the candle.
The work, so much, I thought it was beautiful last night and prompted so much thinking about different aspects of it, from the global to the personal. I do want to ask, we've gone through, a very challenging couple of years, not just the COVID pandemic, but, May 25th, 2020, just a few miles from here, the murder of George Floyd by the police of Minneapolis, and the sparked rage and long overdue racial reckoning, not just nationally, but globally. You were already working on this work, but did that impact and inform any parts of the creation of this work?
I would say it fueled the work, In many ways, this piece is thinking about evil. And how do we contend with evil in a world where maybe some of our demons or our villains are increasingly invisible, long-held racism, institutionalized and personal, the virus, and even thinking about a figure like Leopold. We rarely look at someone like that without saying, he's bad and we're done with him. And what does it mean to encounter the residue in our daily lives of colonialism, of evil, and the kind of looking inward and outward that is necessary to exorcising these legacies?
I thought it was interesting in your note about the exorcism, the ritual, almost like a ritual exorcism of the ghost of Leopold, but of colonialism and racism at large globally. But I wondered if you could talk about that a little bit more. Do you see theater as a means to exercise and deal with historic trauma?
I see theater as a means to encounter one another and deal with whatever needs dealing with. I think at its best, theater is part of a functioning democracy. It's a model for participatory society. We, as theater artists, we create from collectivity and we give unto collectivity. And I think that that in its origins, from being around a campfire to the Greeks, Demoskratia, you know, where voting and theater were happening in the same place, that there's a sense of the civic and of encounter with each other that is built into this form.
Did that make COVID particularly, it obviously was, there was upheaval and destabilization for everyone, but for artists who work with the energy between audience and performer and a collective process of creation, how did you navigate your way through these last 2 years in trying to make this work?
It was pretty outstanding to have the whole world appreciate simultaneously the amount to which our breath is connected. You know, for people to feel connected to parts of the world that they may not imagine themselves connected to, but that the histories of trade, the histories of empire, you know, the histories of revolutionary thought traveling between people around the world, that, you know, our breath has always been connected. So if anything, I think it reminded me of the core of what we do and what it means to gather in space together and to ask, you know, big questions and share breath.
I know as a presenter and a person trying to find the way between audience and creative artists in performance, we had some fear that people wouldn't come back. They get so settled into their home and comfort of routine. But I'm happy last night, an indication of how palpable the enthusiasm of returning together and collectively experiencing together. And do you sense that that will be the future in terms of like that will continue, or is this one of your first chances to see how it functions in that way?
You mean people gathering?
Yeah, presenting your work to a public and post-COVID.
I don't see any world in which we don't need this.
Right.
I think this is hardwired, you know? I enjoy it, you know, we're playing in some augmented reality spaces with this project, and we have a AR piece that we're doing with it, and I'm interested in all of that, and I'm a little terrified by artists who are going deep into the metaverse, but nevertheless interested. But I don't think we're ever gonna let go of what it means to gather in space and our need, our fundamental need for that. I think that in premiering this piece in this kind of delicate return moment, this is the first piece back from the season, right? Or well, you just had
we had a piece, a concert a couple weeks ago, but we're really in our first month of return since last November when we were able to do a piece. But so it really feels fresh. This
moment of return, and I definitely have a deep desire to care for these people. You know what I mean? There's and that was built in early on, a sense of, you know, even the decision to perform in it was something about if what I am asking for is a looking inward and outward, then my body is implied in that question. I shouldn't be asking somebody else to eat this meat hand or kind of hold that language. But also that some kind of tenderness towards people who are going to gather and hold these questions about looking inward and outward simultaneously. And I think that was baked into the work from the beginning, and is even more prescient now. You know, that we offer our audiences, our collaborators, some piece of ourselves, giving them, you know, our tea at the end.
It was a beautiful balance in the work. It seems like from start to finish, there's a juxtaposition between the comforting and the disconcerting, the rawness and the sort of embrace. And I wondered if you could talk about how you look to that balance. It seems like baked into this idea of looking inward and looking outward. But throughout the work, even in getting this wonderful ceramic cup that we get to take home and drinking red tea, but then looking at the bottom and there's a hand, and it's just unsettling, but at the same time comforting in a very odd mix. So could you talk about those aspects?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many materials we've drawn on in this work. Early on, I think years ago I mentioned this to you, that I had started reading this Mark Twain text.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. I remember I was thinking, that must have been 3 years ago. You said to me, like, I've just picked up this Mark Twain, King Leopold soliloquy, and I didn't quite remember what drew you to that text.
I mean, Christopher, my collaborator, had mentioned it to me. I have an uncle in Rwanda, African American uncle in Rwanda, who loves that text, and I had heard about it, so I finally picked it up, and I feel like we all forget that Twain was a journalist.
Yes, right.
We think of him as a novelist.
And he was sent on assignment to the Congo, right? Yeah.
And he refused. He wouldn't go. And then finally he was like, okay, I'll go. And he went, and witnessed the residue of Leopold that he witnessed, and his response coming back was this King Leopold soliloquy, almost kind of fictionalized, journalistic accounting of what he witnessed, and the idea that he felt like he needed a theatrical context to be able to hold the amount of horror and the amount of contradiction and the amount of violence in that world, that like journalism couldn't hold it. He needed a place like a theater to hold that kind of information.
Oh, so was it written? I didn't quite realize. Was it written as a theatrical script?
Yeah, it's a script. It's a performance text.
Oh, I didn't quite realize that. Okay.
Yeah.
Because it's written from the voice of Leopold, and in a kind of Jonathan Swift-like, sarcastic, ironic, but a way to use that to really poke at the brutality. I mean, reveal it in part to the world, and it's kind of a slightly old-fashioned way of, rather than a flat-out like damning critique. It's sort of a subversive way.
Yeah.
But how did you then, as you grappled with the text, you started to think about how I think you quickly decided, I'm not going to just perform this text, and you started to look at other source material.
Yeah, there's so many things we looked at. Of course, Aimé Césaire's Discourse on Colonialism
from 1950, I think. Yeah,
and Patrice Lumumba's independence speech in Congo, and we looked at this. There's this opera by Daniel Auber. It's cited as having ignited the Belgian Revolution, La Muerte de Portini, and we used some of that opera in this performance. And
that's the classical sounding.
Yeah. And the language in it is, better to die than to remain miserable. Is there, throw over the yoke that overwhelms us, perish the stranger. There's all of this kind of language of revolution, and so the story goes that it was performed, and after the second act, people stormed out, and the Belgian Revolution happened. And the idea that Leopold would have heard that language, and you hear that language, and it almost sounds like Lumumba, this kind of the rhetoric of revolution getting recycled, and the kind of I don't know, the cycle of how those ideas morph. So we got excited about that material, and a bunch of the sound is also from these propaganda films that André Calvin and a bunch of other Belgian filmmakers were sent in, I think, 1955 on one of the Belgian kings, kind of, purveying of the region. And so a lot of the sound is also pulled from those propaganda
when
films.
Lumumba gave his speech in 1960, as I've recently read, many thought of it was unnecessarily inflammatory and like, oh, this isn't going to go well, and and then the resonance that it had. it seemed like it spread in terms of Pan-African independent movement and things. Did your family, were they aware of that speech when you were growing up? And I know people like Malcolm X even in the U.S. Were inspired by that speech. But what's your relationship historically to that particular speech?
For sure. My family was in Burundi by that point. I think that the thing that my family holds and the thing that I hold in relationship to that speech is this sense of there was so much thought passing through the globe at that time. There were conversations happening between Harlem and Congo and Vietnam and Ethiopia and Cuba and Atlanta, and this sense that there really was a South-South dialogue happening, and this looking inward and outward at imperialism and evil that produced revolutions, that produced movements of liberation, and that sense that those conversations have been happening, they do happen, and if we can invest in them, there is hope.
Right, yeah.
There is hope.
Almost invest in them again, because that was mid-20th century and things. And,
And this is a hard time to think about hope,
Right.
We were...
I don't mean to.
Yeah, I have a friend who's I think the discipline is called futurist. He studied how to predict the future and works for the only people who can afford that kind of technology and those kind of practitioners are, massive software companies.
Right.
And hearing him talk about, the likelihood of an upcoming delete on humanity.
Yeah.
But within that, within holding that sense of like, what is this moment we're in? Simultaneously, talking with him and his wife who works in education, there's this sense of when we talk to each other, particularly when we talk to each other in these ways of looking inward and outward, and particularly when we talk to each other outside of the institutional kind of constructs that imperialism has left us with. The future is entirely unknown. We build things that can only be imagined. And so I do think that holding of Lumumba and that holding of the kind of global thought that was happening across continents and nations and history feels hopeful.
And hopeful, I think, in some ways, to the resonance of that speech, given that Lumumba himself didn't survive even a year. He was imprisoned and ultimately killed. But the power of those words lived on.
And we didn't see him fail. We didn't see him not live up to all of those extraordinary dreams. We get to hold this moment of the pure push, the pure, the demand into the future, and it's suspended there because we didn't have to encounter the failures.
Right. This is a little bit off of what we're talking about now, but your notion of the great men, that sort of way up high, that you embodied as a woman, and the relationship of how you took on these male, some might say certainly Leopold, sort of toxic male forces. Was that, could you talk about gender in relationship to your embodiment of this, of these figures and these words and things?
I'm sure the impulse towards drag in this performance, for me, and maybe I shouldn't call it drag, maybe I should say my own processing of gender, is probably exactly that, is my own encounter and moving through the residue of these men in my own life, and this feeling of that this is all around us, you know. Soap, the history of soap, like palm oil is in so many of our products and is so much of Leopold and of that history and that moment, and that these echoes are with us always. You know, tea, as you know, what is more British than a cup of tea,
Right?
Right. This is like fundamentally a symbol of colonial enterprise, of imperial enterprise, of their relationship with India, or you know, ornate carpets, or these kind of things that have become the symbols of empire, and even the just material residue in our lives. So I imagine the processing of gender in that way is a way of dealing with the material of gender and of legacy in all of these histories.
The work has a beautiful personal reflection. When we think about great men, you know, movers and shakers on the world stage, and then your talk about your own grandfather as really a reflection, I think, of your own personal sense of what could a great man be, and it's his impact. I love the way you talked about ask almost anybody in a community setting, you know, in that part of Burundi, and they would know your grandfather. Did you use that intentionally as a kind of counterbalance of how maleness or you know, people can work small and have similar impact?
I think it's that sense of echoes, that at the same time as we encounter palm oil or tantalum every day, there are these other ways that echoes exist. There are these conversations that may not be mapped in our history books, but that certainly happened and that produced a Lumumba and produced a Malcolm X and you know, produced a Ho Chi Minh. And so this sense of what are the echoes, and that there are many echoes that we carry with us, and some of them are also histories of favors that have been given and passed down through generations. And I think with these questions of monuments and of great men, even now as people consider monuments and reconsider monuments, monuments are getting replaced with other permanent sculptures. And I wonder about the obsession with permanence, and if that leads us off the scent of what great monuments can be, and that an evening in the theater that disappears, that we all actually carry with us and then pass forward in whatever way our encounters the next day are shifted or not, that maybe working through some of the invisible materials are ways to hold the monumental or offer reverence to the monumental. And so for me, thinking about my grandfather and this kind of community of generosity that I am a beneficiary of generations later, feels like a way to hold that monument to a great man.
Of course, in the frame of the Walker Art Center, where we have a permanent collection and we work in visual art and time-based work, we're often in those conversations of permanence and impermanence and what makes the impermanent special and, you know, powerful things.
And then how to collect it.
We're resisting, but, you know, we commission instead. You know, in your bio, it mentioned that I think is interesting that, and I couldn't agree more, both with Jack Ann, the last work that you brought to us, and KL too, that your work speaks in many formal, cultural, historical, aesthetic, and experiential languages. And I wondered, one of the things that makes your work, one of the many things unique, I think, is how you navigate the lines between the experimental and the accessible. And I wondered if you could talk about your strategies in that regard.
I think about making a piece like making a feast, and I want everybody to eat. Everybody eats, and the feast is prepared on behalf of particular audiences. I think that great art speaks many languages, and it's the impulse towards inclusion or towards the accessible is an impulse towards excellence. I think that that is fundamentally a pursuit of excellence, because I believe that great art requires speaking many languages, historical, cultural, experiential languages.
It's really counter a sort of older notion of the avant-garde, which was like, well, if it's too easy to get, then it can't be good or something, you know. And Christopher and I were laughing last night about a funder that started a sort of vanguard notion of the narrative. We're going to fund the narrative,
Yes.
like storytelling. But do you think there's a kind of return to, or an acceptance, because your history has been with experimental artists like Wooster Group or ERS and things, and so I wonder about whether we in the contemporary art world are reopening up ourselves to some forms of accessibility.
There's always these questions of legibility,
right?
I think part of why I started making my own work was because I felt like I spoke more languages than I was being asked to use or being invited to use in the rooms I was in. But some of the languages that excite me most are less legible to audiences who comfortably arrive into our cultural institutions. And so there's a demand for me within my practice to invite audiences who will render the work visible.
Right.
And cultural institutions are tasked with serving the public, and so rarely serve a public representative of the cities that they're in. And for a myriad of reasons, right? It is an uphill battle to invite audiences who have been historically disinvited. But that is an uphill battle that I find joyful, to try and fail and think about what does it mean to kind of extend invitation, in part because I am excited by theaters as pillars of democracy, and in part because it is fundamental to the legibility of my work to have audiences who speak many languages gather.
And you have that, I remember going to our good friend, colleague Drew Klein's space in Cincinnati, the Contemporary Arts Center, and when I first got to see Jack and you and the cast and your whole team had been that afternoon, like the day I got there, out like connecting with community organizations and people on the street, and you just have that ability to sort of bravely say, hey, I think you might be interested, and why don't you where institutions sometimes are a little more timid or afraid to don't quite know how to make the invitation seem authentic or effective.
They were never set up to do that work, and I think that's part of the challenge. As artists, I think that for me as an artist, that lives in the root of my practice, in the root of my desire to ask questions and to platform civic dialogue and to engage with people. That's in the root of how, creating through collectivity and giving unto collectivity. And I don't think cultural institutions were set up to do what they are being tasked to do with right now. And I think the cracks are showing.
We see that. Right. Yeah. Well, you may be jumping from the discussion of openness and accessibility to perhaps one of the harder aspects of the work that audiences might have found. Which I found so intriguing, but I stretched too, is when you're up on top as the kind of monumental dictator mix of people, the text is intentionally deconstructed. It's a mosaic almost of all these different source materials, and so at different moments you're not sure whose voice you're listening to. And I wondered if you could talk about that construction and how you kind of and how you found audiences or created it so that audiences could grab shards of it and that would be enough, or how you think about that text and its delivery.
Yeah, it's a kind of Frankenstein of the Twain, King Leopold soliloquy, of Césaire's discourse on colonialism, and of Lumumba's independence speech. Like the opera, the Daniel opera that I mentioned, I'm interested in the rhetoric of great men and the challenges of the form of great ideas and greatness, and the strangeness of moving from something like the glory and possibility and triumph against evil in Lumumba's speech, and Leopold defending his exploits as written by Twain, and holding those things next to each other and holding the Frankenstein of them. We kind of almost go into I think of it as a song. Ian goes into his punk rock whatever overture, and I think of it as a song and as of holding that beast, all of that simultaneously, and that expulsion, that is the exorcism, that is the leaving of the spirit, and that is the holding the looking inward and outward, and the strangeness of the container of greatness. Like the strangeness of elevating language and ideas and ambition, and that maybe that pursuit of the permanent, or that pursuit of the great, is part of where the cracks come.
Because maybe what we experience next as viewers of your work, as participants, are the descent down and your removal of the facade of Leopold, the makeup, the beard, and a very beautiful domestic and personal story of your daughter and Fiddler on the Roof and tradition and things. Could you talk about that leap from what is a kind of almost horrifying, intense, dark, monumental, to a very gentle and personal, and then weaving in other dark threads as you continue on?
But I think there's a sense of, as we hold this residue and these echoes of colonialism in our daily lives, no matter what we do, that we carry these echoes, that there are all these other echoes that we carry with us, the joy at listening to a song that's maybe a little problematic, or or the echoes of generosity or of kindness or of whatever has gotten our own families through, that we are also carrying these echoes simultaneously. And I think that remembering that we're carrying both is maybe how we exorcise the residue of what we don't want, and keep trying to build the things we actually want, the worlds we actually want to live in.
Your physicality in the work, it's so memorable. I can't wait to see it again tonight. You are a trained theater artist, but clearly you command the stage with a kind of intensive choreographic, language. And when you got off the throne, it's almost at moments of sort of ecstatic swirling, and then moments of almost like you were electrocuted back into the throne, and your use of arm movements up on top, and your rocking motion here before you ascended, that felt almost like its own form of exorcism, or a kind of physical traumatic, almost experience you were going through. Could you talk about the development of the physicality of the work and the choreography?
I definitely think of sound as architecture, and so much of building the physical score for me was about developing that sound design with Camila Ortiz and Ian Askew.
Yeah.
So I think of the sound that we built as the architecture of the physical life. Yeah.
Was it a challenge? I mean, you really, in many ways, you have an incredible team, and it was like an ensemble work, but so much of the work you had to carry on your own shoulders. It was a solo that required you to, move, act, be sort of the center of attention throughout, and inhabit all these different personas and things. Would you want to talk about, well, how was that? I mean, did you enjoy it? Was it it must have taken months of rehearsal on yourself and things.
Yeah, I think the wonderful thing about getting to develop work over time is that there really is a sense of the candle dipping. And the physical score pulls on, a bunch of different source material as well, going back to those roots of the Wooster Group and ERS.
Sure, right, yeah.
And perhaps in very different lexicons. So, a return to a video source material that I worked with early on Go Forth.
Which was really your first performance work. With Chris.
Yeah. And so looking at some of the videos of rituals in Niger that we had thought about early on, and kind of repossessions of colonial magic and exorcism of colonial magic, while also repossessing it, looking at some of those videos, looking at Mussolini and those kind of, we have that Mike bouquet up there of the dictator, and looking at some of that physicality. There's almost a Charlie Chaplin Charlie Chaplin's in doing the Great Dictators, and the kind of there's looking at some of those videos, there's almost a humor in the performer. Like at moments you're like, are you making fun of yourself? But some of that physicality that now reads as a cartoon, but was really the physical language of some of those great horrors, and then the experiential vocabularies, the experiential languages, the squat of myself, of my aunties, of my grandmother, the laments, a bunch of kind of Catholic iconography around the Sacred Heart, and kind of thinking about Catholicism as a tool in all this, and then and some whispers of Rwandese dance, some whispers of the horns of the cows, and the kind of way that dance figures in celebration and in social life.
One of the nice things about dance as a form, a movement, non-text-based movement, is we're all able to bring our own impressions to it. And so when you were squatting and rocking and tapping your head, it almost felt to me like this is the evil that has been buried, attempting to kind of come to the surface in someone like Leopold or other forces who have, all of us who have evil inside in some way, and it's trying to get out of your body. And it felt like that kind of trauma.
Yeah, it feels like one of those kind of iconographic mourning positions. Yeah.
The work begins with are audiences lined up and coming to wash their hands. It's immediately a sense of ritual, and it's quite dark in theater, and people find their way to the seats, and you conclude with really offering everyone a cup of tea with these wonderful ceramic cups that, as we mentioned, is both comforting and disconcerting with the image of the hand at the bottom, and people are able to, if they would like, take them home. I guess I see it as kind of an expansion of the notion of when the arc of a performance, from the moment that people really stand in line to start to wash their hands to the time they take their last sip of tea out in the bar. Was that the conscious thought around, like, yes, a piece has the performative start and end, but really it expands far beyond that?
For sure, absolutely, absolutely. And the prayer that as we gather and have exchange and civic dialogue, that we want to make those tales longer and longer.
Yeah. Like it could, like our conversation today. I mean, in some ways, we're continuing, and I think the resonances of this work last night and the rest of the next few performances, and after you leave us, and all those who got to experience it, will just continue to resonate with the folks lucky enough to see the work. So I think that may be a good place for us to end, but I want to thank you not just for the work last night and coming through COVID, coming through all that we've gone through to make this really powerful piece, but also our ongoing relationship, as we talked about before, from back in the first conversations around Jack and the chance to work together on multiple pieces. And I will look forward to our next chance to collaborate and work on, or support your work together. So.
Well, likewise, for all of the listening that you have done and supporting and collaboration on building this piece and on Jack and I think, as we were saying before, it is unique and extraordinary to have exchange with an individual in an institution that is based on practice, that is not only about a product that is being made, but what does it mean to engage in artistic practice with a curator, with an institutional practitioner in some way. It's really unique to get to hold practice with somebody and not only think about particular products, but to think about kind of artistic journey at large. So thank you for all of your support.
Thank you, and I wish you the best. This work will tour to LA and to New York and
Kigali.
Oh, do you think so?
Yes.
Really? Great.
It's gonna happen.
Oh, that's great.
And the festival in Haiti, we hope too.
Oh, I'm so happy to hear that. I wasn't sure if COVID had rendered that asunder.
Well, it's gonna. I mean, we will hope that in Haiti's new revolutions. I don't mean revolutions. What do I mean? We'll cut this part of the interview. Haiti's next incarnations of self, that it will be possible to gather there and show work, which many people think, in a few years will be possible. But we've been talking to them about it.
Sure.
And then talking to Hope in Kigali.
And Belgium, too.
And Belgium, yes. Dreas.
Anyway, well, Kaneza, thank you so much. We'll look forward to tonight and tomorrow and the future together. So, thank you.